New developments this morning in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. Law enforcement says they are looking into new evidence near her home in Tucson, Arizona. Authorities say they are looking into a damaged utility box near the home. Investigators say the equipment could be connected to a reported internet outage in the area around the time she vanished. The outage may have disrupted nearby surveillance systems, potentially affecting video evidence that could have helped track down the suspect. Authorities say they are close to a breakthrough, but much of the evidence remains confidential. Nancy Guthrie was reported missing more than a month ago. The family is offering a $1 million reward for information leading to her recovery.
On February 16, 2026, the Pima County Sheriff stepped before the cameras and officially cleared the Guthrie family. The announcement was definitive, closing the door on the son-in-law, Tommaso, as a person of interest. But here is the thing. While the public heard innocent, the documented reality told a different story. In a forensic evidence lot miles away, the car Tommaso drove that night sat under seal for weeks after his supposed clearance. Why hold a vehicle if the driver is no longer a suspect? What I found was a massive contradiction in the lab reports. The DNA profile recovered from the scene was actually a complex mixed sample that had not even been fully decoded when the sheriff made his move. The thing is, how can you officially clear a prime suspect when the most critical forensic evidence is still sitting in a test tube 2,000 miles away? Let us analyze these 9 chilling details together. So, it starts with a simple drop-off. It was Saturday evening, January 31, 2026, in the affluent Catalina foothills of Tucson. The desert air was cooling down, and for Nancy Guthrie, it should have been just another quiet end to a family dinner. Tommaso, her son-in-law, was the one behind the wheel that night. He drove her home, watched her walk inside, and according to his own statement to investigators, he saw the garage door close at exactly 9:50 in the evening. And this is important because that 9:50 timeline is the only fact we have from a witness who is also a subject of interest. From that moment on, Nancy Guthrie was alone. Or at least, that is what the official record wants us to believe. The thing is, when you are the last person to see someone alive, you become the North Star of the entire investigation. Everything the police build from that point on relies on the accuracy of your word. If that 9:50 timestamp is the anchor, then everything that follows is a race against a ticking clock. From there, the house went silent for nearly 4 hours. Nancy was 84 years old, and she relied on a pacemaker that was constantly syncing with her cell phone. It was her digital heartbeat, a silent guardian that recorded every spike and every lull in her cardiac rhythm. But while the house appeared peaceful from the outside, something was shifting in the dark. At 1:47 in the morning, the first mechanical failure occurred. The Google Nest doorbell camera at the front entrance did not just glitch, it was physically disconnected. In other words, someone stood on that porch and deliberately cut the feed. This was not a power outage. This was a tactical strike. At this point, we enter the most terrifying window of the entire case. What happened next was a 41-minute blackout that investigators still cannot fully explain. Between 1:47 and 2:28 in the morning, the security of that home was systematically dismantled. Meanwhile, the motion sensors at the property detected a presence, but because there was no active video subscription, no images were captured. Then, at exactly 2:28, the pacemaker went dark. The sync stopped. The digital heartbeat flatlined. That 41-minute gap is the window where Nancy Guthrie was removed from her life, which tells us that whoever was in that house knew exactly how much time they had before the world would notice. The reason this matters is the sheer precision of it all. You do not just stumble into a house in the Catalina foothills and know which wires to pull or which sensors to avoid. You need a blueprint. You need to know the layout. At this point, I started questioning the distance between Tommaso's departure and the first camera going down. There is a 4-hour gap between 9:50 and 1:47. In the world of criminal investigation, 4 hours is an eternity. It is enough time to drive across town, establish a presence elsewhere, and create a paper trail of normalcy. And this is the first real shock of the case. The distance between the last confirmed sighting and the first act of violence is just long enough to make you wonder. Do you think that is enough time to set an alibi, or is it just a tragic coincidence? Let me know in the comments. The problem is, the sheriff's department never publicly accounted for where Tommaso was during those specific 41 minutes. They confirmed he dropped her off, but they never provided a verified receipt, a neighbor's witness statement, or a GPS log that placed him in his own bed 4 miles away. Instead, they focused on the garage door closing at 9:50. But as any investigator will tell you, a closing door is not a conclusion. It is just a curtain falling. What happens behind that curtain in the hours that follow is what determines the truth. Because of that, the first 2 pieces of evidence, the last sighting and the digital blackout, are inextricably linked. One provides the start of the clock, and the other provides the end of a life as we knew it. But the space in between is where the shadows are the darkest, which means we have to look closer at what else was moving in those Tucson streets while the rest of the world was asleep. The thing is, in a high-profile kidnapping case like the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, the physical evidence usually moves faster than the headlines. But in this investigation, there was one piece of machinery that seemed to be stuck in a legal limbo for an uncomfortably long time. We are talking about the family vehicle, a late-model luxury SUV that Tommaso was driving on the night of January 31st. This brings us to our third chilling detail. On February 2nd, just 48 hours after Nancy vanished, the Pima County Sheriff's Department executed a seizure warrant for that specific car. They did not just look at it, they towed it to a secure, climate-controlled forensic facility. Now, normally, if a witness is cooperative and their story checks out, a vehicle is processed for fingerprints or basic biological sweeps and returned within a few days. But that did not happen here. Instead, the car remained under a strict forensic seal for weeks. This is the part I could not get past. If he is cleared, give him the keys back. Why keep the car? The reason this matters is that forensic lots are not parking garages. They are expensive, high-security environments where every hour of storage has to be justified to a judge or a district attorney. Which tells us they were looking for something specific: transfer evidence from Nancy's house. In other words, they were searching for microscopic fibers, desert soil that did not match Tommaso's own driveway, or perhaps most importantly, epithelial DNA that shouldn't be in the driver's seat. At this point, the official narrative was that Tommaso was just a grieving family member helping with the search. But meanwhile, back at the lab, technicians were quite literally tearing the upholstery apart. Because of that, we have to look at the psychological pressure Cooker Tommaso was living in. Being the son-in-law in a dynasty as famous as the Guthrie Savage family is not just about attending holiday dinners. It is about living under a permanent microscope. When Nancy went missing, the national media did not just focus on the desert, they focused on the family tree. Every move Tommaso made was scrutinized by millions of amateur sleuths online. The pressure of being the outsider who married into American royalty is immense. You are always one mistake away from being the villain in the public's eye. And then, there is the car. Imagine being told by the police that you are no longer a suspect, yet every time you look at your empty driveway, you are reminded that they still have your steering wheel, your floor mats, and your GPS history under a microscope. The problem is, the timeline of the vehicle's release does not match the timeline of the sheriff's public clearance of the family. If the DNA results from the car were truly negative, that vehicle should have been washed and parked back at his house by February 10th. Instead, it sat in the shadows of the evidence lot well past the middle of the month. Does this sound like the treatment of a man who is completely in the clear? Or does it look like the police were waiting for a single hair or a speck of dust to prove he was somewhere he said he wasn't? Think about it. If you were in his shoes, would you feel exonerated? Or would you feel like the walls were closing in while the police held onto the one thing that could prove your movements? Let me know in the comments. Which means, we have to ask, what exactly were they hoping to find in those seat crevices? In kidnapping cases, the car is often the secondary crime scene. It is the vessel used to transport a victim from the safety of their home to the isolation of the desert. If even a single thread from Nancy's favorite blue robe, the one she was reportedly wearing that night, was found in the trunk or the rear footwell, the entire simple drop-off story would collapse. At the same time, the investigators were likely pulling the telematics data. Modern cars record everything: when the doors open, how much weight is in the passenger seat, and exactly where the wheels stop turning. At this point, the car was not just a car, it was a silent witness that refused to be silenced. And as long as the sheriff kept those keys, the cloud of suspicion stayed firmly over Tommaso's head, regardless of what the press releases said. The thing is, modern crimes leave two types of bodies, the physical one and the digital one. While the search teams were scouring the Arizona desert for Nancy Guthrie, the Federal Bureau of Investigation was quietly dismantling the home's network. Meanwhile, back at the tech lab, the FBI found something chilling. This leads us to our fourth piece of evidence, and it is perhaps the most damning indicator of an inside job. When the kidnapper entered that home in the early hours of February 1st, they did not fumble in the dark. They did not trigger the floodlights by accident, and they certainly did not trip over the complex perimeter sensors. What I found was a pattern of knowledge. In other words, the kidnapper had the blueprint. They knew exactly where the blind spots were. They knew which camera at the side entrance had a lag in its recording cycle, and they knew precisely which wire to pull to kill the Google Nest feed without triggering an immediate cloud alert. At this point, you have to ask yourself, how does a random intruder from the street know the specific technical vulnerabilities of a high-end security system in a gated community? The answer is, they don't. This was someone who had walked those halls. This was someone who had perhaps watched the installation or had access to the master app on a smartphone. This brings the circle of suspects down from a city of millions to a handful of people who had been inside that house within the last 90 days. And this is important because it shifts the motive from a crime of opportunity to a crime of meticulous planning. The intruder acted like a ghost in the machine, moving through the house with a level of comfort that only comes with prior access. But the digital trail did not stop at the front door. From there, investigators moved to the browser histories and the cloud accounts associated with the family's inner circle. This brings us to our ninth piece of evidence, a detail so bizarre it feels like it was ripped from a Hollywood thriller. Before the kidnapping even took place, a device linked to the family's digital profile performed a series of highly specific searches. They weren't just looking for recipes or vacation spots. No, they were looking for the exact property tax records and the architectural floor plans of Nancy's residence. But even more disturbing was a search for the net worth and annual salary of Nancy's daughter, Savannah Guthrie. The problem is, why would a family member need to Google the salary of their own sister-in-law? Unless, of course, they were calculating the potential payout of a ransom. The search for Savannah's salary. Is that a sign of a ransom motive, or just family curiosity? What is your take on this? Let me know in the comments. Because of that search history, the FBI began looking at the financial pressure points in Tommaso's life. In other words, they were looking for a reason. Why would a man with a comfortable life risk everything? The reason this matters is that in the world of true crime, money is the most common denominator. If you are looking at a ransom target, you don't just pick a random elderly woman. You pick the mother of a global news icon, whose earnings are a matter of public fascination. What happened next was a deep dive into the timestamps of these searches. They occurred in the weeks leading up to the disappearance, creating a digital breadcrumb trail that led straight to the front door of Nancy's home. At the same time, the investigators found that these searches were performed on a private browser mode, suggesting a conscious effort to hide the activity. Which means this was not an accidental click. This was a reconnaissance mission. At this point, I started questioning the official clearance. Again, how do you explain away a Google search for a family member's wealth right before that family member's mother is snatched from her bed? The thing is, digital evidence does not lie, but it can be misinterpreted. The defense would later argue that everyone in a high-profile family is curious about their relative's success. But when you pair that curiosity with the surgical deactivation of a security system, the picture becomes much darker. It paints a portrait of a predator who was measuring the value of the prize before they ever stepped foot on the property. What I found was that the kidnapper did not just want Nancy, they wanted what Nancy represented. And that is why the ghost in the machine is the most terrifying witness of all. By the first week of February, the atmospheric tension in Tucson had reached a breaking point. The desert searches were coming up empty, and the public was screaming for an arrest. This leads us to the morning of February 7, 2026. While the Guthrie family was publicly pleading for Nancy's safe return, a tactical unit from the Pima County Sheriff's Department was pulling up to Tommaso's private residence. This was not a social call. This was the execution of a high-priority search warrant. At this point, investigators weren't looking at the desert anymore. They were looking in the garage. This brings us to our fifth chilling detail, a concentrated, 3-hour forensic sweep that ignored the living room and the kitchen entirely to focus on a single, concrete-floored space. The thing is, why spend 180 minutes in a garage if you are just looking for a missing person? You don't hide a grandmother behind a lawnmower. Which tells us they were looking for transfer evidence. They were looking for the staging area. When the investigators finally emerged, they weren't empty-handed. They were carrying several brown paper evidence bags, carefully sealed and labeled. According to leaked manifest logs, those bags contained vacuum-sealed dust samples, a pair of dark industrial coveralls, and a roll of heavy-duty adhesive tape that did not match the brand usually found in the house. At this point, I started questioning the voluntary search narrative. Was it cooperation or was it a chess move? Because of that, the focus on the garage became the turning point of the entire week. If Tommaso was truly helping, why were the most suspicious items found in the one place where a car could be cleaned out of sight? Meanwhile, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was finishing a secret document that would change everything. This leads us to our seventh piece of evidence, the physical profile of the masked intruder. By analyzing the few seconds of grainy footage captured by a neighbor's driveway camera and cross-referencing it with the height of the door frames at Nancy's house, the Bureau created a precise anatomical sketch. The intruder was described as a male, approximately 6 feet tall, with a lean but athletic build, and a distinctive gait that suggested a slight favor to the right leg. But the detail that sent shivers through the department was the mention of a dark, well-groomed mustache visible beneath the edge of a tactical mask. The problem is, that description did not just fit a general category of person. It was a mirror image of Tommaso. From the exact height of 72 inches to the specific grooming of his facial hair, the profile was a match. In other words, the unknown subject, described by the world's best profilers, was living right under the family's roof. Because of that, the profile started to narrow down until there was only one name left on the list. When you combine a 3-hour forensic raid on a garage with a physical description that fits you like a glove, the word coincidence starts to lose its meaning. The reason this matters is that the FBI does not guess. They use photogrammetry and biomechanical analysis to turn a shadow on a video into a set of hard measurements. At this point, you have to wonder what Tommaso was thinking as he watched those agents carry bags out of his home. Was he confident that he had cleaned well enough, or was he realizing that the digital and physical worlds were finally shaking hands? What happened next was a series of closed-door meetings between the sheriff and the district attorney. They had the clothes from the garage, and they had the physical profile from the FBI. But the thing is, they still didn't have a confession. They were playing a high-stakes game of forensic poker. If you were an investigator and you saw a man who matched the FBI's height, weight, and mustache profile perfectly, and then you found industrial tape in his garage, would you walk away? Or would you double down? Let me know in the comments. At the same time, the family's legal team was starting to circle the wagons, claiming that Tommaso's height and mustache were simply common traits in the Southwest. But the FBI's report mentioned that distinctive gait. A specific way of walking that is as unique as a fingerprint. And guess who had been spotted limping slightly after a weekend hiking trip, just days before the kidnapping, which tells us the voluntary nature of his cooperation was likely a desperate attempt to appear transparent while the evidence was literally being bagged and tagged right in front of him. The thing is, when the public hears the word DNA, they think of a gavel hitting a mahogany desk. They think it is the final word, the ultimate truth that either locks a cell door or swings it wide open. But in the Nancy Guthrie case, the biological evidence was not a period at the end of a sentence. It was a question mark that the sheriff's department seemed very eager to ignore. This brings us to our sixth chilling detail, a piece of evidence that was presented to the media as a shield for Tommaso, but when you look closer, it looks more like a shell game. On February 16th, the official statement was that no DNA matching the son-in-law was found within the national databases. In other words, a no match in CODIS is not a not guilty card. To understand why this matters, we have to talk about what CODIS actually is. Think of it like a giant digital phone book, but instead of names and addresses, it lists the genetic profiles of people who have already been arrested or convicted of serious crimes. If you have never been in the system, your name is not in that book. Your number is not listed. Tommaso, a man with no prior criminal record and a clean history in the eyes of the law, would never have his DNA inside that database to begin with. So, when the sheriff stood up and said there was no match in the system, he was technically telling the truth. But he was telling a truth that meant absolutely nothing. The problem is, the DNA recovered from Nancy's bedroom was not a clean, single-source sample. It was what forensic scientists call a mixed profile. This means the genetic material of at least 3 different individuals was swirled together on the bedsheets and the door handle. Imagine a bowl of alphabet soup where the letters from 3 different sentences are all mixed up. You can see the letters, but it takes a massive amount of time and advanced software to unmix them and figure out which sentence belongs to whom. Because of that, the initial laboratory sweep was only able to check for known criminals. It did not, and could not, instantly compare the sample to Tommaso himself without a direct buccal swab, a process that requires a specific court order or voluntary consent that had not been processed at that time. The reason this matters is that the direct comparison, the real test, was not public yet. At this point, the sheriff's department was under immense pressure to show progress. The city was terrified, the Guthrie family was mourning, and the cameras were rolling 24 hours a day. By announcing a no match in the national database, they managed to cool the temperature of the room. They gave the public a reason to stop looking at the son-in-law. But meanwhile, back at the private lab in Virginia, the real work was just beginning. They were slowly, painstakingly separating those genetic strands to see if one of those 3 contributors matched the man who dropped Nancy off at 9:50 that night. This is the part I could not get past. If you are an investigator and you know a suspect's DNA is not in the system, why would you use the lack of a database match to clear him in the eyes of the press? Does a clearance based on a database search feel like a real clearance to you, or just a PR move to calm the public? Let me know in the comments. It feels like a calculated distraction. What happened next was even more suspicious. As soon as that press conference ended, the urgency to collect a direct sample from Tommaso seemed to vanish. In other words, they used a technicality to create a narrative of innocence before the science was actually finished. What I found was that mixed profiles are the most contested areas of forensic law. Defense attorneys love them because they can argue that any DNA present was touch DNA or transfer DNA from a previous visit. They could say that Tommaso's genetic material was in the house because he had been there for dinner just hours before. But that is exactly why the investigators needed to be precise. If his DNA was found in a place it should not be, like inside the panel of the security system or on the tape used to silence a victim, the family dinner excuse would not hold up. But by announcing the database clearance so early, the sheriff essentially poisoned the well. He made it almost impossible for the public to accept a different truth later on. At this point, The DNA evidence was not being used as a tool for justice. It was being used as a tool for optics, which tells us that the investigation was no longer just about finding Nancy. It was about managing the fallout of a case that was becoming too big for the Pima County authorities to handle. But the thing is, the molecules don't care about press releases. They are still sitting in those test tubes, waiting for a lab technician to find the one sequence that matches the man with the blueprint. And once that happens, no amount of PR will be able to stop the clock from restarting. The thing is, headlines have a way of cooling off a room, even when the fire is still burning under the floorboards. When the sheriff announced that the Guthrie family was cleared, the national news cycle moved on to the next tragedy. But behind the scenes, in the hallways where the real decisions are made, the air remained heavy with suspicion. This brings us to our eighth chilling detail, a piece of evidence that does not come from a lab or a camera, but from a human voice within the highest levels of law enforcement. Even after the official press release was drafted and signed, a high-ranking source within the multi-agency task force refused to back down. They continued to maintain that Tommaso remained the primary person of interest, regardless of what the public was being told. What struck me here was the silence of the source. They did not take it back. Even after the family was cleared, that person stayed firm. And honestly, that scares me. It tells us that there is a massive divide between the public relations version of this case and the actual investigative reality. In other words, the clearance was a strategic pause, not a total exoneration. When a veteran investigator risks their career to whisper that a suspect is still the one, you have to listen. It suggests that they are holding a card that has not been played yet, perhaps a piece of evidence so sensitive that exposing it now would ruin the entire prosecution later. At this point, we have to look at the 9 details we have uncovered. We have the last confirmed sighting at 9:50. We have the systematic deactivation of the cameras and the 41-minute digital blackout. We have the suspicious 3-hour garage search and the car that was kept in forensic lockdown long after the clearance. We have the FBI's physical profile that matches Tommaso down to his mustache and his walk. And then, there is the search for Savannah's salary and the complex mixed DNA profile that was never actually compared directly to the son-in-law in that initial announcement. Because of that, the entire investigation starts to look less like a search for a kidnapper and more like a high-stakes chess match between a family's legal team and a department under fire. The reason this matters is the lesson we take away from the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. It is about the fragile boundary between a clean investigative process and the crushing weight of media pressure. In celebrity cases, the truth is often the first casualty of the news cycle. We want answers immediately, and when the police cannot give them, they sometimes offer a distraction instead. But as we have seen, small deviations in how information is released, like calling a database check a clearance, can completely derail the public's understanding of justice. It creates a shield of innocence that may not actually exist. What I found was that the truth does not care about your net worth or your family name. It only cares about the math. It cares about the GPS coordinates, the genetic sequences, and the minutes on a clock that can never be recovered. At this point, I want to hear your theories. We have laid out 9 details here, from the garage to the Google searches. Which one is the smoking gun for you? Or do you think Tommaso is truly a victim of circumstance, caught in a nightmare he cannot wake up from? Let me know in the comments. The problem is, as we sit here talking, Nancy Guthrie is still missing. An 84-year-old grandmother did not just evaporate into the Arizona heat. Someone carried her out of that house. Someone knew the codes. Someone knew the timing. And the most terrifying part of it all is that the DNA results from the independent private lab are still pending, which means the most chilling detail might be the one we haven't found yet. What happened next will depend on those microscopic strands of life currently being processed in a cold room on the East Coast. What happens when that lab report finally lands on the sheriff's desk? Will the door that was closed on February 16th swing back open with a vengeance? Until then, the case remains an open wound in the desert, and we are left watching the shadows, waiting for the one piece of evidence that finally brings Nancy home. Thank you so much for walking through this investigation with me. These 9 chilling details paint a complex picture that is far from over. If you found this breakdown insightful, please hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon.